few days ago, we learned that King Solomon, David's son, built a temple in the city of Jerusalem. The temple was a place where God's Spirit lived. But the people had disobeyed God, and the land was taken over, the temple was destroyed, and the people were taken away to a faraway land. Some of the Israelites were taken to Babylon, which was later taken over by the Persians and called Persia. One of those people was a man named Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel was one of King David's children's children. He spent his whole life growing up in Persia, which was a beautiful place, but it wasn't his home, and it wasn't where God wanted Zerubbabel to stay. So God had a special plan for him, a plan to return to Israel, to return home, to rebuild the temple. Zerubbabel could hardly believe it. The temple was such a special place, and he couldn't believe that God had chosen him to rebuild it. He knew that if they were rebuilding the temple, that God was getting ready to come back to the people. But there was one tiny little problem. Zerubbabel needed to ask the king of Persia if he could leave. As soon as he realized what God was asking him to do, he went straight to the king and said, "Oh, mighty king, oh, kingly king, most kingish and king-like of all kings, can I ask you for an eensy-weensy, teeny-tiny, itty-bitty little favor?" "Of course, Zerubbabel," said the king, "anything you need." So Zerubbabel asked the king if he could go back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple, and if he could, take a few thousand people with him. That seemed like a really big ask, but Zerubbabel knew that he needed the people to help him rebuild the temple, and he also knew that the people were ready to return to their home. And to his surprise, the king said yes. God was using the king of Persia to bring his people home. The king didn't know it at the time, but he was fulfilling the promise that God had spoken long ago through the prophet Jeremiah. A promise that said, "You won't be gone forever. The temple won't be gone forever." Does it feel like you're all alone? Does it feel like my plans aren't working? That's not true. I'm still with you, and I have a plan. Not a today plan, but a tomorrow plan. Actually, it's a forever plan. It's a plan to make all the wrong things right and the dark things light. It's a plan to bring you home, a plan to bring you to me. When the king of Persia let the people return home, those words became a reality. As soon as Zerubbabel arrived in Jerusalem, he began work on rebuilding the temple, which was not an easy thing to do. You see, there were people who didn't like that he was rebuilding the temple. In fact, they tried to ruin the work that he was doing. But God was with Zerubbabel. He was with him when he was far away from home in Persia, and he was with him when he was rebuilding the temple. He was even with Zerubbabel when his enemies tried to stop him. And so with time and patience and God's help, the foundation of the temple was finished. Zerubbabel and a priest named Jeshua gathered God's people together, and they sang the same song that Solomon sang when they built the first temple. God is good. His love is better. We hope he'll live with us forever. And then the people celebrated. They danced and sang songs, they played instruments, they worshiped God, but some of them were still sad. They remembered the first temple that had been built by Solomon. Some of them had only heard stories, but they were still sad. This temple, this new temple, was beautiful and wonderfully made, but it wasn't the same. The people began to realize that maybe a building made of gold and wood and fabric wasn't the best way for God to be with the people. Maybe God needed to come another way. And they weren't exactly sure what that looked like, but what if God came to live with them as a living, breathing person? Emmanuel, God with us. Zerubbabel wasn't sure exactly what God was going to do, but he knew that God was still up to something, and it was something big. And until the end of his life, Zerubbabel repeated the same old song in his heart, a song that said, God couldn't remain. Sin drove him away. So Zerubbabel began to hope and to pray, God, will you come back to stay?